up logic with respect to what we've come to understand in the modern day about what it means to relate, to be in harmony with the planet and the natural laws that actually govern us, that define us really, and what will enable true sustainability and prosperity, which are firmly technical notions. Part one, the organism of knowledge. We live in a society that tends to judge the messenger. Have you ever noticed that? Rather than take the data on its own merit. If I gave you guys a piece of paper, it presented a series of ideas or a book, would you need to know who wrote that paper, who wrote those ideas to decide if you agreed with it or not? This tendency is based on the assumption that we as individuals actually serve as sources for any ideas that we have or share, that we are truly original in anything that we talk about or communicate, and that who we are, or maybe our biases or cultural sourcings, somehow transcend the information itself when critically analyzed against the benchmark of our scientific method of evaluation. So people love to dismiss others for what they say, attack them personally, but they fail often to just take the data on its own accord and analyze it against really what is the ultimate benchmark that we've come to understand for data, the scientific method, the scientific reality. The key word here is causality. A common flaw to mass psychology today is how we think about the origin of things, when in fact we can find absolutely no beginning and no end when it comes to discovery, invention, or thought. Everything is just feeding in and out of itself, interweaving. This emergence is a fairly new understanding to human history, I might add, and it should be no surprise that we share this superstitious view very often as people begin to continue to attack the messengers. In fact, you could say the same thing about the notion of evolution as it's attacked by those who still believe in intelligent design or old religious traditional views. It's very convenient for us to assume point-by-point sources when it's much more complicated for us to actually think of the whole of evolution, whole of the evolution of knowledge. So we have a unique tendency to personify and to categorize in very tight frameworks. So again, it should be no surprise. It should also be no surprise that the attacks, especially if you're really radical, such as the things that we talk about in the Zeitgeist movement, very foreign to many academics and what they've been trained to promote and communicate. The attacks tend to go against the person and not the objective analysis against the scientific benchmark. I can't emphasize that enough. Put another way,
I beg your pardon, was that meant to be misspelled? It says casualty.
oh, no, it wasn't, so thank you. Though casualty has its own nice connotation to it, doesn't it? Excuse me, spell check went crazy. That's what you get when you make presentations on planes. So, put another way, human beings on this knowledge level are basically vehicles, if you will. Our brains absorb existing data and combine it with other data through our intellectual filters, only to re-output it again, or hence communicate it into the environment to others as information. And others absorb, process, and output again, and on it goes. And as that process continues, the knowledge itself actually evolves, much like biological evolution does through time. Processing through the environment of the group mind, if you will, with our social communication and hence educational accents, like this institution, keeping the process going. As a quick example, Albert Einstein did not discover or invent relativity by any technical sense of the distinction. For him to have done so, he would have had to invent the whole of mathematical inquiry since antiquity, along with all the tools, supporting provisions, and everything else that would enable any conclusion of such to manifest. He was merely an extension of the work of others, which of course now is continually extended even more so by the work of his, successors, if you will. Therefore, again, judging the messenger for their communication and their beliefs makes absolutely no sense. The only judgment that can possibly exist in this regard is with respect to the information itself and how it holds up to critical analysis again. I hope that's clear. I say that because if you don't agree with something said here, you're not actually disagreeing with me. You're disagreeing with the information. I am completely irrelevant. This might sound like a trivial point, but if you actually take this to heart and really begin to look at the way you view the world, to consider the group mind and the way you're interconnected and what you share, and the way we're all responsible in a certain sense for how information flows, for what information's out there, for even the actual actions of yourself and each other, you'll change your view dramatically. You'll stop pointing fingers. You'll stop projecting responsibility into the environment for social problems. It's a very profound notion to realize that we're existing in this unity that's evolving knowledge simultaneously. Now, part 2, system consequences. How did our current socioeconomic system come to be, and why do we have the growing problems we do now? I think the philosopher that Shar actually mentioned earlier, Jiddu Krishnamurti, gave the best intuitive summation. The crisis is a crisis in consciousness, a crisis that cannot anymore accept the old norms, the old patterns, the ancient traditions. And considering what the world is now, with all the misery, conflict, destructive brutality, aggression, and so on, man is still as he was. He's brutal, violent, aggressive, acquisitive, competitive, and he has built a society along those lines. It appears that there's a conflict occurring here between our old, traditional, static worldviews and the resulting institutions that come from them, and the emergent, ever-changing evolution of knowledge and awareness, which, given enough time, has proven to continually alter and override everything that we think is true at any single point in history. Everything. In other words, we've created this traditional society long ago based on very limited information, and due to the self-preserving mechanisms that are built into it, by the way, which is a consequence of that limited information. And I could go on a long tangent about establishment structures, self-preservation. The very nature of the profit system is self-preserving as opposed to emergent. These institutions want to remain, but for another conversation. We have stubbornly kept these ideas in place for various reasons and such mechanisms in the face of an ever-quickening state of change that is violently disturbing the integrity of those old institutions and traditional approaches. The rate of change in human society long ago was very slow compared to what's happening today. The fundamental factor of social change, which is information and physical technology, knowledge and tools, is now increasing exponentially almost outside of our control as the organism of knowledge speeds up. With the effects of that change not only making completely obsolete many institutions that have appeared relevant, have appeared permanent in the past, but also bringing to the surface completely unreconcilable inherent problems that simply went unnoticed before. Every dominant governing institution today, from politics to economics to general philosophy, has proven to have some seriously detrimental, outdated, and flawed attributes, and the more they remain in the wake of these new understandings and abilities, the more they will destabilize society, causing increased suffering. This isn't to say, again, that the prior institutions did not fulfill a need at that point in time. They certainly did. But we're blindly holding on to them as though they are relevant and applicable when they are definitively not. And this is the core of the psychological structural problem before I go into more specifics. Traditional institutions fighting to maintain their self-preservation in an absolute clash against an unstoppable emerging reality, the evolution of knowledge, and what it means for us to actually relate to the environment. And there are numerous examples I can give of this. One is technology and war. Back in the day, sticks and stones and catapults and all of that stuff had a very limited effect. And you could have a distorted culture with a distorted value system, believing in things like sovereignty. You could have a culture that actually felt the need to protect themselves and saw no other route than to assume enemies over here and protect themselves and maintain their family or their culture or whatever identification they chose to. But now it's a little bit different. When the Cold War occurred, we had nuclear weapons, which today, by standards of nanotechnology, would be like a Roman catapult very soon. There are things that are happening now that will enable a level of destruction so vast that we can't have the types of values that we have, the outdated structures, the outdated sovereignties. It can't work, or we will self-destruct. And it's already almost happened, obviously, very recently in history. And that was primitive. I recommend everybody go home and Google nanotechnology weaponry, And you'll be blown away by what's in store in the military establishments and how dangerous it is for us to share these divisive notions at this point in human evolution. But I'll leave that there. We're going to jump right now into 5 social problem categories. By the way, this presentation is adapted from a presentation I did this weekend at Occupy Wall Street in New York, and I was approaching this through basically their grievances, many of the things that you hear in the news and media. And my goal with this was to show how all of this stuff comes back down to a root foundation, which is the very structure of our economic system. So here are 5 social problem categories. We have wealth imbalance, which would deal, of course, with class and absolute and relative poverty. If you don't know what absolute and relative poverty is what you see with the billion people starving that are literally just dying off. And relative poverty is what you see in the Western world with homeless people and people that can survive, so to speak, but they're not getting their needs met and they're very sick. Second section, public health, living standards, safety, things like that. Third section, labor, such as unemployment or even exploitation like sweatshop slavery. And of course,